This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Alice is going to be talking about rural handicrafts in interwar England. So.
Thanks, Dion. I'm going to be talking about, as Dion said, rural handicrafts in the Women's Institute movement in the interwar years. And broadly, my argument is that handicrafts were a popular part of the Women's Institute education programme, but handicraft work also produced objects which could be sold, and cooperative craft industries developed during the war and in the years after the war. But ultimately, the Women's Institute's policy towards handicrafts ended up focusing on education and leisure, and I think that channelled the craft object away from industry and markets, and potentially there was a missed opportunity to address the economic problems of the countryside through the development of craft industries. So for those of you who don't know, the Women's Institute formed in 1915 to aid food production during the war. They were specifically aimed at rural women, and local branches formed which were affiliated to a county federation which linked up to the National Federation of Women's Institutes. And their club meetings and programmes varied regionally, but broadly, over a space of a couple of hours, 2 to 2.5 hours, they would have an educational lecture or demonstration, followed by a social half hour, which might include games and singing and dancing. And then they had the tea, and tea was a very important part of enacting democracy, talking about the importance of democracy, because there were instances where the local gentry would expect to be served first, and it was very contested, so there was a sort of broad structure of the Women's Institutes. And their aim soon broadened, so they started off to aid food production, but their constitution in 1917 described their main aim, as being to enable women to take an effective part in rural life and development by providing for the fuller education of country women in citizenship, in public questions both national and international, and by instruction and training in all branches of agriculture, handicrafts, domestic science, health and social welfare. So they were really trying to mobilise rural women, and they provided a broad education programme. And I've highlighted citizenship and handicrafts because they sort of relate in interesting ways, which I'll talk about later. So handicrafts were an important part of their education programme named in the Constitution. And by handicrafts, I mean a useful or decorative craft which is made by hand and associated with the home. And there are a variety of crafts carried out under the auspices of the Women's Institute. Curtain making, obviously, is one of them in your village hall. But this is just banner making, rug making, glove making, fur craft was always a popular one, basketry, cobbling. And in 1918, the Carnegie UK Trust gave the Women's Institute a grant of £1,000 to continue with their wartime work of initiating and assisting cottage industries. So I find it quite interesting that they describe this craft work as a cottage industry. Cottage industries, of course, are small-scale industries operated from the home rather than the factory. I mean, this is a kind of the typical image that the word cottage industry evokes. Women working at home, and traditionally a dealer or supplier would come in and to give women materials. They would then make products and give them back to the dealer to then sell on. So they provided women traditionally with an income, a way of making money, but they were sometimes quite exploitative, with products made in sort of rural poverty then sold on into as luxury items. But occupational communities formed around cottage industries, such as the lace trade. So people would buy Bucks Point lace, which is from the East Midlands, and communities formed around that where skills would be passed on through families, from mothers to daughters, and through informal apprenticeship systems. And I think that the organisation of craft industries under the Women's Institute sort of mirrored and inverted that tradition. Because Women's Institutes they produced rural craft products, which evoked this kind of tradition, this idea of the cottage industry, but they were organised cooperatively to benefit the members, to benefit the makers, rather than a sort of middleman. The first craft to become sort of established in this way was toy making, and the National Federation of Women's Institutes formed a toy society to support the development of the toy industry. The first one that they sold on a large scale was Cuthbert Rabbit. And this image is actually from Twitter. Lucy Wolsey, who's a Tudor historian, which is, a public historian, because it's their centenary year, she sort of has, she did a lecture on the Women's Institutes, calling them cake bakers and troublemakers. So they're really having not been taken seriously for quite a long time, for being quite conservative. The Women's Institute all of a sudden being celebrated, and she went on a search for an original Cuthbert and found that one. But this is a description of sort of the process of making and selling these toys from a member of the Sussex Women's Institute, and they were who were the first to produce Cuthbert rabbits on a large scale. So she said that they received a large London firm for 11 dozen animals of 5 different kinds, and with the help of other villagers, completed the order to the satisfaction of the firm. The animals are sold an average of 24 shillings per dozen. All the work, once learned, can be done by the workers in their spare time at home. The materials are bought wholesale, cooperatively, so that the toy makers get the full benefit of the sellings. The middleman, the agent, is eliminated and everybody benefits. So when I said that they were sort of inverting that tradition of the cottage industry, I mean that they, as she described it, they got rid of the middleman and the actual member could benefit. She went on to say that she wanted her village to become the nucleus of a flourishing, soft toy industry, which I think says something about the ambitions of some of the individual members and the way that this gave them an opportunity to make money in a way that they perhaps hadn't had before. And when she mentions the other villages that specialised, she, was involved in teaching other members of Women's Institutes how to make toys, and they would each specialise in a different type of toy, and they did tend to be rural in character. So they made oats, ducks, little piglets, and they would sell these on to London firms. And other crafts included basket making and fur craft, and there was a rapid and enthusiastic response from other institutes sort of wanting to learn these skills. But the Toy Society unfortunately ran into trouble quite early on. It was undercapitalised. They suffered from competition from abroad for these kind of products, and it was difficult to get a uniform standard. These large London firms they're talking about, sort of ordering big quantities of toys, obviously wanted certain standards that weren't important if you're just making this toy within the home for your child. So the the National Federation of Women's Institute were faced with a decision quite early on. They had to sort of make a choice between continuing with supporting this kind of activity of making crafts for trade, or they could support crafts for personal use. And they discussed this in their the minutes of the meetings of the National Federation. It's a bit of a dilemma for them, do they continue with the trade route or do they go down the personal route? And they decided that because selling on this scale opened up the products to the scrutiny of a commercial value system, they decided that they should go down the route of encouraging crafts for self-supply, or just for the maker. The industry subcommittee tellingly was renamed the handicrafts subcommittee, and they decided to encourage a revival of handicrafts for home use rather than the development of trade industries. And towards that goal, they set up the Guild of Learners. So the Guild of Learners is quite significant. The use of the term guild sort of implies, workmanship and a degree of authority. And the aims of the guild were to regain the practice of home handicrafts with a view to restoring the best traditions of English workmanship, and to assist in bringing the best instruction in handicrafts within the reach of the villages. So I think these aims really sort of emphasise the move to personal use and the educative value of the craft rather than crafts for sale. And they established proficiency tests in craft. So there were 3 different types of tests: an A test to show you were proficient in craft work, a B test enabled a member to demonstrate the craft to other people. At Women's Institute meetings, I said initially they'd have something educational, and the C test was a teacher's test, so that they could teach other people. So they differentiated between demonstrating and teaching, and there was also a judge's test to kind of judge whether someone was proficient in a craft. So members would have to send off their craft item to be examined, basically, and then they would then get a certificate. And they had to show not only that they were proficient in actually making the craft, but also that they knew something about the history and the cultural significance of the craft. So members had to pay, to be a member of the Guild of Learners, you had to pay £1 a year on top of the 2 shillings membership to the Women's Institute. So, it's quite a lot relatively, half your membership again. And it was officially launched in February 1920. It had 600 members by 1922 and 1,000 by 1927. And the county federations would organise craft groups where they could come, where women could meet together, and they organised tests and for these examinations. This is a Guild of Learners badge. The Women's Institute, each different branches of the Women's Institute had different sort of badges, which I think shows the very localised nature of the movement, because the badges would sort of vary. But they also had their own Guild of Learners badge, which again I think it's a way of trying to show these kind of hierarchies and proficiency and skill. Again, the use of the term guild implies a skilled workforce, and I think the use of badges, that kind of paraphernalia, reinforces that. So this is in the Women's Institute archives, and she was, proficient in making fur gloves, and had also passed her teacher's test. So through the Guild of Learners, there was an emphasis on learning and leisure rather than profit as the main motivation for craft work. And the role of the National Federation of Women's Institute changed. Rather than supporting the development of cooperative craft industries through the Toy Society, they sort of re-established their role as one which was to support the education and training of learners rather than workers. And they showcased the high standards of work achieved through national exhibitions. The exhibition hall, compared to the shop or the marketplace, provided a controlled space to show these crafts. And it could lead to quite a lot of tension and resentment in terms of what got chosen to be displayed at exhibitions, and what didn't. And they would tend to be very busy, these exhibitions. Their national exhibitions were always held in London, So this is at the Caxton Hall. Their 1922 exhibition was at the V&A. So you're talking about the importance of spaces and buildings, moving away from the commercial aspect of crafts. It became very important for the guild to align crafts with the art world instead. So whereas their first craft exhibition in 1918 was primarily to show objects for sale, and it resulted in £330 of profit for the National Federation of Women's Institutes, and £1,000 was paid out to different members. And by 1920, the emphasis in exhibition is really on the aesthetic of display. And in their 1920 exhibition, they had a lecture with slides showing the development of handicraft work, and they said, and the effect of handicraft work and the development of civilization. They employed Miss Priest. I don't know her. I haven't been able to find out her full name, but they employed someone called Miss Priest as a technical organizer to try and ensure consistency of standards and to raise the standard of craft work. And she had a column, Notes on Handicrafts, in Home and Country, which was the journal of the Women's Institutes. And through this column, she enforced the differentiation between crafts for industry and crafts for home. In May 1920, for example, in her column, she said, as distinct from industries which were primarily connected with money-making, handicrafts had as their first essential enjoyment in the work for its own sake. She went on to say, in industry, capital, premises and trade conditions had to be considered. In handicrafts, we worked in our homes, supplied our own good material instead of buying ready-made, bad and expensive, and we revived the old crafts for which English women were once famous all over the world. So I think in terms of the guild and their aims of trying to restore a tradition of craft work, she was very much situating women as the kind of inheritors of this great tradition of English workmanship. And she kind of carries that forward throughout the 1920s, throughout the period. I was surprised when I was reading this Notes on Handicrafts column by how many references to citizenship I found within the column. And she said she drew attention to this herself, saying, well, why, what place does citizenship have in a column on handicrafts? But she went on to explain, there are many people whose circumstances and occupations are such as to shut them out from the practice of handicrafts. But there is no person with any aspirations to good citizenship who can be indifferent to it. For after all is said, the whole well-being of the state is built up of handwork. I just find that a very interesting quote. The well-being of the state is built up of handwork. It's sort of trying to root citizenship in handicrafts, and this is obviously significant given that the right had just been extended to women over 30 after 1918, and so I think there was a kind of search for a way to sort of legitimise that citizenship in a way. And when historians have looked at the Women's Institute and other associations like the Women's Institute, they've sort of put an emphasis on their informal education in politics and citizenship in terms of campaigning and committee work. So I was interested to see them connecting handicrafts, which seems like quite a separate, frivolous thing, with citizenship. And she sort of does this throughout the 20s. And I think rooting handicraft work and citizenship reinforced their status as home-based and educative. So it's sort of reinforcing that crafts are not primarily to be sold, therefore a sort of higher purpose. But it was also a way of addressing broader issues such as women's place in national life. And the high aesthetic standards expected from this new sort of lofty status of the craft object to something which connects the state, the nation with the home, was obviously easier for some women to achieve than others. And there were obviously a lot of tensions in the Women's Institute around class. It sort of has this impression of democracy and women coming together, and that was something, an ideal they were very much working towards, but there were obviously huge differences in terms of, you know, the sort of resources that women had. And one woman who described herself as a working man's wife wrote into Home and Country in 1928, saying, "The Women's Institute is to benefit all women in the villages, and though equality of membership in the Institute is a real thing, we cannot help belonging to two classes, leisured and unleisured. It seems to me obviously unfair that a hard-working woman who has to do her craft work just how and when she can, with hands roughened by housework, should be judged exactly on the same lines as people who have servants and can sit at their work as long as they like, besides having far greater advantages in the matter of being able to keep their work clean. My own idea would be to deduct at least 25% of marks for leisure, and the label of the work would have to be endorsed leisured." This sparked a sort of debate that was kind of ongoing. Obviously, I don't have access to the actual letters. It's only what was sort of edited and presented in Home and Country, but it shows the tensions between members who, like this woman, described herself as a working man's wife, and those who she said had servants. I think that movement in the emphasis on craft work for aesthetic purposes to be displayed in the exhibition hall rather than for the marketplace, and obviously sort of perhaps benefited the middle class members more than working members. The woman who wrote about her experience on the second slide I showed about, you know, making these different crafts and that sort of sense of excitement of selling on to a London firm and making money, that sort of by the end of the 20s is kind of being marginalised in favour of, you know, creating craft work that were beautiful and could be displayed at an exhibition. And that trend continued with the Depression in the 1930s. In 1931, the Secretary of the Development Commission wrote to the National Federation of Women's Institutes about a complaint that had been made by the National Federation of Furniture Trades. And the National Federation of Furniture Trades has complained about a proposed scheme of classes in upholstery being held by the Board of Education. So it wasn't anything to do with the Women's Institute, but the Development Commission wrote to them to let them know that because they hold a lot of classes in similar crafts, you know, I listed at the beginning the basket making and covering a chair, they thought that the Women's Institute should know so that they could avoid teaching each other crafts, and which could pose an unfair subsidised competition with trade interests. So the Development Commission didn't want the Women's Institute to give legitimate ground for complaint from the trade, and the Women's Institute responded immediately by cancelling all their classes in upholstery. And at their 1932 exhibition, they said that no sales could take place. So whereas in 1918 at their exhibition, it's primarily about selling the objects on displays, profit gets shared out, throughout the period, that activity gets marginalised. The exhibition halls just have a tiny sales table. It's mainly about show. By 1932, no sales can take place at the exhibitions. So just to conclude, I've got 3 main points. I think the Women's Institute promoted the idea of continuity whilst reformulating traditions associated with domestic and rural life. And by that I mean they drew on this they drew on the idea of rural heritage. They talked about restoring English heritage. But it wasn't just a sort of simple nostalgic or backwards looking. It was about trying to do new things. So the way that they introduced their proficiency tests and trying to sort of formalise that process and teaching each other. They were kind of conservative but modern at the same time. by the mid-1920s, their handicraft policy had moved towards an emphasis on learning and leisure, and that shift gathered momentum following the Depression. And I think, it's significant in that, as we saw with all the talk about citizenship in the handicraft column, I think they were sort of reasserting the value of handicraft skills to modern life by associating it with citizenship. And a lot of the historiography on women's institutes is sort of, celebrating the way they renegotiated domesticity. So I don't want to downplay that, but I do think that sort of overshadowed the commercial potential of the craft object as a means to bring in income, which could potentially have been helpful for rural working women. So.